AP Biology, first quarter review, part 2. In this part, we're going to go through population ecology, community ecology, ecosystem ecology, and the biosphere. Remember that ecology studies everything from individuals up to the biosphere. Population definition is the members of the same species, one species, that lives in the same area and interacts and interbreeds with each other. Estimating population size. For stationary organisms, it's easy. All we do is count up the number of organisms in an area, like the number of elm trees in a square kilometer, and then we multiply by the number of square kilometers in the forest. For moving creatures, however, we use mark and recapture. Mark and recapture formula is pretty straightforward. There's the population size represented by the symbol n, which will equal the number marked in the first catch. In our example, we have 50, times the number caught in the second catch. In this example, it's 100, divided by the number of recaptures in the second catch that were caught twice, the first time and the second time. So in this example, we have 50 times 100, which is 5,000, divided by 10 recaptures, which gives us 500 as the estimated population of this moving organism. Patterns of dispersal. The most common is clumped. Clumped is where groups of animals kind of hang out together. Now for prey animals, that's pretty useful. You can see predators coming and you can use that for protection. Some predator animals are able to use that clump pattern to take down their prey, like a pack of wolves. Random pattern of dispersal is seen most commonly in things that are either solitary hunters, like some of the cats out there, like a cheetah, as well as things that spread themselves by natural processes. In the case of trees and spreading the seeds by wind, the seeds are randomly spread by wind, so they have a random pattern of dispersal. The uniform pattern of dispersal is usually found in things like birds. Birds have a clump pattern, but they have a little bit of elbow room, mainly for nesting space. If the other birds get too close to their nesting space, they chase those birds away, so they have like this little space around them, and that's called the uniform pattern of dispersal. Demography. Demographics is the study of the population size as far as it goes up and down, and we have something called a life table that helps us analyze this. A life table tells us the year-by-year age group of survivors every step of the way. For example, we have the squirrel life table here from 0 to 1 years old, and it tells us how many die in that year and how many survivors make it to the next year. And basically we can use this to make something else called a survivorship curve. Now, changes to population size is pretty straightforward. Population sizes go up with births and immigration. Think integration, or coming into a population for immigration. Emigration and deaths decrease the population size. This is called a survivorship curve, and we have 3 types of survivorship curves. These are made from life tables. The type 1 survivorship curve is exhibited by things that tend to not die when they're young or middle age and only start to die when they get older. You have a flat line and eventually starts to go down very quickly at the end as the older members of that population start to die out. Typically these are organisms that are K-selected, which means that they have survival traits that are better for stable environments. So once an area has been colonized by the R strategists, the K strategists can take from those R strategists that resource if they're better adapted. For example, there is no insect that can deprive an elephant, a K strategist, from getting at that grass in the savanna. Remember that K strategists also have good parenting and few offspring. Examples include big herbivores as well as many of the larger predators. In a type 2 survivorship curve, we have organisms being preyed on and killed at a relatively constant rate all throughout their lives. Whether you're a baby squirrel or a middle-aged squirrel or an old squirrel, you are found delicious by things like cats and dogs and wolves and everything else that eats animals like squirrels. So a type 2 survivorship curve is exhibited by a constant mortality of that population over time. A type 3 survivorship curve has most of the members, the offsprings, dying when they're young, when they're juveniles. Most fish, insects, and other aquatic creatures tend to have large number of eggs, but most don't make it to adulthood. Only a few make it to middle age and adult years when we're dealing with our strategists. Our strategists reproduce in large numbers, they don't have very good parenting, and only a few make it to adulthood. They're better adapted, however, for taking over unstable areas after a disturbance. Carrying capacity. Can populations continue to grow exponentially? The answer is no. Exponential growth is exhibited by a J-shaped growth curve. Basically, it's a situation when there's a lot of resources with no competition for those resources. Now, the population will eventually be affected by the amount of food and other factors in the area, but it's typically food. Carrying capacity is represented by the symbol K, and it's the maximum population size the environment can support with no degradation to the habitat. That doesn't mean it's the entire amount of food available for that organism. For example, if we're talking about a forest, which has, let's say, enough trees to feed 2,000 deer, but they would use up all the food to feed those 2,000 deers, they would far exceed the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity means that the plants have to have time to replenish those leaves and be sustainable for next year and the following year and the next year. So carrying capacity wouldn't necessarily be the 2,000 deer. It might be far less than that, maybe only 1,000 deer that can be sustainably supported with no degradation to the habitat. Now, carrying capacity is not fixed. If you have a flood or a fire, you're going to destroy the food. The trees are the food for something like deer, and as a result, carrying capacity goes way down. As far as how many population members can be supported by the reduced carrying capacity, well, it just depends on how much damage was done to the food source. So here we have the two graphs that you need to know. Exponential growth, again, J-shaped growth curve. We have a population that's fairly stable at first, and then eventually you get enough members where you have rapid rise in population due to no limiting factors and no competition. Population goes up and up and up, but eventually you reach something called carrying capacity, K. Once carrying capacity is reached, the members will start to starve, the population goes down, and eventually the population kind of hovers around a amount of food available in the ecosystem. Not all living things reach carrying capacity. If it's an organism that's affected by a lot of predation or disease, some organisms never reach carrying capacity. But in situations where there's, as a general rule, food as the major limiting factor on the population, then carrying capacity definitely plays a role. Parental survival, the cost of larger broods to both male and female parents. Basically what we have here in birds is the larger brood size or larger family size, the parents survive less because they're spending all their time getting all the food for those larger families. If it's a smaller family size, smaller brood size, the male and female tend to survive better. So there's a trade-off. Regulation of population size. Limiting factors are things that limit the population size, or things that can limit the population size. Density independent means that the limiting factor is independent of how crowded the organism is, or how dense the population is. An example would be fires, earthquakes, and other environmental disturbances. There is no worse fire as a result of deer being crowded in a forest or sparsely populating a forest. Either way, the fire has the same amount of effect on the forest. Now, of course, there might be more deer or something else that die from the fire if they're crowded together, but the fire doesn't cause the problem of density to become worse or a higher death rate as a result of that limiting factor. Density-dependent limiting factors refers to things that become more of an issue, a death rate that increases as the population becomes more densely crowded. For example, if you have a food supply that's limited in an ecosystem and we have a very dense population, the dense population of organisms is going to use up that food supply faster, and there's going to be a higher death rate much more quicker. If there is a sparse or not very dense population, they're not going to use up the food supply as quickly, and there's not going to be as big of an issue as far as death and starvation. Competition becomes more of an issue as the population becomes more crowded. Same with predators. They have more to catch and eat when the population becomes more crowded in the prey animals. Predator-prey interactions, population cycles. These snowshoe hares are never reaching their carrying capacity. However, as they go up in population, the things that eat them, the lynxes, also have food to eat, and they go up as well. The lynx population eventually rises. As the snowshoe hare population drops, the lynx population drops soon afterwards as a result of not having enough food, and the lynx population never reaches their carrying capacity. They're totally dependent on that one food source, the snowshoe hare, and as a result of the snowshoe hare population going down, the lynx population goes down as well. So this is another factor affecting population sizes and population ecology. The snowshoe hare is about the only thing the lynx eats in its ecosystem, so it's completely dependent on that one food source. Age structure pyramids, you have to be able to analyze this. At the bottom of this age structure pyramid in Kenya, we have between the age of 0 and 4, about 8% of the population being female, and about 8% being male. It's about a 50-50 chance of making a male or female. As you take a look at the middle-aged folks in this age structure pyramid, you see a far less percent of those middle-aged and old folks versus the young folks. There's a lot more young people than there are old people in Kenya. Now, what's the relevance of this? As the population that's young gets older, they reach reproductive age, they start having their own kids, and the population is going to increase rapidly. This age structure pyramid, where you have lots of kids, but not lots of middle-aged or old people, is indicative of a rapidly growing population. India also has this rapid growth age structure pyramid. Slow growth, United States. Here we have the bulge in our middle-aged folks, and these are the baby boomers. The baby boomers, as they get older, are going to cause problems with making sure that we can keep them alive in their retirement years when they're not actively working and contributing to the economy, and instead are pulling away money for their retirement. The things that people have to worry about with the United States bulge for baby boomers is how we're going to afford to make sure that everyone who's a baby boomer has a decent retirement. Then over here we have the zero growth and even a decrease in population. We have a lot more old people versus young people. The problem that Italy faces is that as their population gets older, they have fewer young workers to support the older population, and their economy has to reflect that in the future if they want to continue giving benefits to the people that are not currently in the workforce anymore. Human population exhibits exponential growth. The reason why, we've increased our carrying capacity, our food supply, as a result of agriculture and the Industrial Revolution. Community ecology. Symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic means the relationship of two different species with each other. We have competition. Both are negatively impacted if they're competing for the same resource. If a lion and a hyena are both eating the zebra, neither benefits from them both trying to get the same food source. If you have two species that have the same role, the same niche, the same food source in an ecosystem, as well as the same habitat, one will eventually exclude the other in a process called competitive exclusion. Competitive exclusion is where one species, basically a better adapted species, takes over a resource and a habitat from another species until just that one species is left over. Now, if they don't have the same niche, they won't exclude each other. For example, you could have maybe two types of birds living in the same tree, but if one bird eats the fruit and the other one eats the insects in the tree, there's not going to be any competitive exclusion because they don't have the same niche. They have a different food source. In predation and parasitism, we have one being positively impacted, one negatively impacted. The prey is negatively impacted by the predator who's eating it. The parasite has the positive interaction. They're the ones that are benefited in their relationship. The host, or the organism that the parasite's feeding off of, is the one that's negatively impacted. The difference between predation and parasitism is parasites live either on or in their host. Predators are not living on or in their host. A quick side point about competitive exclusion. Competitive exclusion can result in resource partitioning. We talked about this in class. When you have one type of species that is pretty close to another type and they're both in the same niche, if one of the species that's not as well adapted moves to another area and makes use of another resource in that area, then you might have this partitioning of different food supplies and habitats called resource partitioning that results from competitive exclusion. Right, mutualism. Mutual means together, and these are things that work together, the Disney kind of things in nature. Lichens are both algae and fungus combined. Algae does the sugar making and photosynthesis. Fungus kind of protects it and surrounds the algae. They work together. That's called mutualism. Commensalism, one benefits, one doesn't care. The barnacles filter feed while attached to the whale. They benefit, while the whale doesn't really get impacted negatively or positively. A niche is the organism's role in the environment. It's a complex term, but typically it includes what it eats it, and where it lives, and any other role it has in the ecosystem, like earthworms aerating soil for oxygen to get to roots of plants. Over here we have a barnacle that could live a little bit lower. However, this lower one, Balanus, is better adapted, so it competitively exclude the thalamus, and the only place that the thalamus can survive is at the top. The Balanus can't survive that far out of the water, so that's why thalamus is able to survive up here. There's no competitive exclusion. They've partitioned the resource of the side of this bank in order to survive and reproduce. All right, resource partitioning, basically separating out little areas as a result of competitive exclusion. One species better adapted than the other. Habitat is just where it lives, local address. Biotic factors affect survival and reproduction. How does a bunny make lynx faster as a population? Well, slower lynxes don't eat bunnies, and they don't survive and reproduce as well, leaving only the faster lynxes behind over time. The lynx population, which is a biotic factor, makes the bunnies faster because the slower bunnies get eaten, leaving the faster bunnies behind, selecting for faster rabbits. Same is true of camouflage. If camouflage does provide a survival advantage, then that can be selected for if members that have that camouflage survive and reproduce better. Cryptic coloration is also called camouflage. Aposematic coloration is warning coloration, and we have some examples here with the monarch butterflies as well as the poison tree frogs. Vestigial mimicry is where one organism mimics something that's dangerous, but the one that's mimicking is not dangerous. This hawkmoth larva is very delicious to birds. However, because its back end kind of looks like a snake, birds avoid it. That's an example of vestigial mimicry, something harmless that looks harmful. Think of it as a Nerf bat. Nerf bats look dangerous, but they're not, just like this hawkmoth larva. Mullerian mimicry is where both are dangerous, and they both kind of support each other's selection for those traits. It's almost like aposematic in this case, where both are being selected for their aposematic coloration. Yellow jackets and cuckoo bees are both to be avoided. Animals learn to avoid them, and if they avoid one, they'll avoid the other, and vice versa. So they both end up being selected for this pattern that drives away other things that might want to eat it. Species diversity, why is that good? Well, greater diversity means greater stability in an ecosystem, and basically what we have here is a nice stable ecosystem with a lot of different plant life producers supporting the animal life. If any one type of plant gets destroyed for whatever reason, the other ones can kind of fill in the role of that missing plant as a food source if it's available to those animals that might eat it. Over here we have almost all one type of tree, that type A tree, and if anything happens to this type A tree, there's not a whole lot left over in this ecosystem. You'd probably see a collapse of that ecosystem afterwards. Trophic or feeding structures, we're talking about food chains here. Food chains are linear, they don't show the complex relationships in every ecosystem. However, if you take a look here, we always start with a producer. The producer in the food chain is called a primary producer. It's always some kind of plant or some kind of aquatic plant like phytoplankton or algae. Then if something eats the primary producer, something eats the plant, that makes it an herbivore. An herbivore is always some kind of primary consumer. Primary consumers are an animal. Any consumer is a heterotroph, any producer is an autotroph. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. The reason why they're called secondary consumers is because they eat a primary consumer. Secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers are all some type of carnivore. Secondary is a carnivore of herbivore. Tertiary is a carnivore of another carnivore, and that's the same with the quaternary consumer. The reason why we don't have food chains that go on forever is because of the inefficiency of energy transfer. Eventually you run out of energy and you can't really support enough links in a food chain to make it go on much further than maybe 4 or 5 links. Food webs actually show all the complex interactions in an ecosystem. Now there's a couple of things you should be able to do with food webs. The first is that it just shows the relationships, the feeding relationships in the ecosystem, but you can also identify the producer by having, looking for the organism with arrows pointing away from it. Now remember, a food web only includes, or food chain, or food web, only includes the living parts of an ecosystem. If there was a line or an arrow coming from somewhere as far as energy transfer, it would be coming from the sun, but the sun's not included because it's not alive. Phytoplankton are the base of this food chain. The other thing that you have to figure out is what's the impacts on other animals or plants, if that's the case. For example, if the elephant seal population goes down, you'd expect the squid population to go up because there's less elephant seals eating it. You'd expect possibly the smaller toothed whale population to go down because there's less food for those smaller toothed whales. They eat the elephant seals. Remember, the arrow points to the eater. The arrow points to the direction of energy flow. You never see an arrow pointing at a plant. You should also be able to identify the level of consumer the organism is based on the food web. For example, the birds here occupy the level of primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, but they also occupy the level of primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. And you can even make it so it's also the quaternary consumer as well. So you should be able to figure out the level of the trophic level every organism is based on what you know from reading the food web. Community structure: a dominant species just has the most biomass in the community. Keystone species exerts an important regulating effect on other species in the community. And usually, but not always, it can be a predator that suppresses an herbivore that would take over an area, like in the case of Pisaster. Here we have Pisaster that controls a type of clam or mollusk, and if Pisaster is not present, the mollusk basically takes over and biodiversity of all the other species goes down. So without Pisaster, without the keystone species of this predator, you have less biodiversity because this the thing it eats takes over an area. The other example we had for keystone species was the sea otters. Sea otters are a keystone species because they suppress sea urchin populations, as kooshball animals, and if the sea otters aren't present, the kooshball sea urchins just kind of take over everything, leaving nothing else for anyone else, dropping the seaweed population, dropping the food supply for other organisms. Another example of a keystone species that's not a predator would be the Arctic hare in places like Wyoming. The Arctic hare is like the only food source for things like the lynx. So when the Arctic hare population goes down, it has a dramatic effect on the other populations as well. That's a keystone species. Energy transfer: remember that energy transfer is much less than 100% efficient. Only about 20% or less of energy makes it to the next trophic level. The other 80 to 90% is lost as heat. Nutrients are recycled, however. The blue represents matter, and the matter does get recycled in the ecosystem back to the producers, whereas energy gets lost as heat at every step. Pyramids of production: this is a energy pyramid showing the loss of energy at every trophic level. We have 10% of the 10,000 joules of energy stored in the tissues of the grasshopper. That's only 1,000 joules. 10% of that making it to the tissues of the mouse. That's only 100 joules. And only 10% of that making it to the snakes. That's only 10 joules. And as you can see with this energy pyramid, you eventually run out of energy, and you can't support any higher level of consumers. This is the reason why we typically see more plants than herbivores and more herbivores than carnivores. However, you don't always have to have more herbivores than carnivores, and you don't always have to have more plants than animals. For example, if the plant is really big, like a tree, you still might have 10,000 joules of energy, but there might be only one tree that has all 10,000 joules instead of like a field of grass or a field of plants. So in a pyramid of numbers, it wouldn't necessarily look like a pyramid if it's a big producer, but an energy pyramid always looks like a pyramid because the producers are always going to have more energy than the consumers, and the lower level consumers more energy than the higher level consumers. The biomass pyramid will always look like an energy pyramid. The biomass, or the living matter, is where the energy is being stored. So whether it's a forest full of trees or grass or anything else, most of that energy will be found in the producers. You'll have about 10% of that making its way into the consumers, so you'll have about 10% of the biomass in consumers that you have from the producers, and then even less than that for the top level consumers. Once again, a pyramid in numbers doesn't always have to look like a pyramid. You could have a triangle where you have a smaller number of producers, but still have a large biomass and energy capturing ability of a tree. Succession is, after a disturbance, it's a series of replacement events. Primary succession begins without soil, begins with just rocks. And you could turn the rocks into soil using bacteria, lichens, and mosses. The lichens and bacteria will start to break down the rock with their enzymes, and when they mix their lichen bodies and bacteria bodies with the broken down rock, that actually makes dirt. Secondary succession starts with the soil intact. Now, whether we're talking about primary succession with the rock first or the secondary succession with the soil first, succession in both cases works the same way. We have grasses replaced by shrubs, replaced by trees. A climax forest is usually the tallest trees that can take over that area. Now, that doesn't always mean that you're always going to have succession. In places like the Midwest, you tend to have just grasses because it's too cold and dry for trees to do well, and grasses are able to hold it. Also, the frequent prairie fires also prevent trees from kind of getting a foothold. Abiotic factors are non-living chemical and physical factors. Biotic factors are living components, animals and plants. Remember that the photic zone is the zone with a lot of light. That's where we're going to have a lot of photosynthesizers making use of that light and doing photosynthesis that provides the organic molecules for the consumers. As you get further and further down into a lake, you get less and less light, and eventually there's not a whole lot of photosynthesis, and there's, in general, less life in the bottom parts of the lake. Now, in an ocean environment, we have a couple more terms. The abyssal zone is at the deep parts of the ocean. Basically, we have chemicals coming out of these deep sea tubes, these vents, and these chemicals can be used by chemoautotrophs. Chemoautotrophs are the autotrophs that are at the base of the food webs in the bottom of the ocean. But for the most part, it's the photoautotrophs, the photosynthesizers in the photic zone, that provide most of the energy that will be used by the aquatic ecosystems in the ocean. Pelagic just means deep ocean. Intertidal means that place where the tide comes in and out. Usually things that can hold themselves in one place, like barnacles, are found in intertidal zones. In pelagic zones, we find more free-swimming or drifting organisms, like sharks and jellyfish. One other point, occasionally things die from the photic zone, and scavengers that take advantage of that, like crabs, will eat the dead remains of animals like whales that end up making its way down to the bottom. The limiting factors in marine ecosystems are light, temperature, and nutrients. And of course, at depth, you get less light, so you have less primary productivity. You have less organic molecules being made. In terrestrial ecosystems, we include moisture because water is a limiting factor for plants on land. Energy transfer, remember that energy moves through an ecosystem but is lost at every step of the way, and then nutrients are recycled. Primary production, open ocean, covers the most part of the Earth's surface area. It also has the most amount of primary production, or converting carbon dioxide into things like sugars during photosynthesis. The second most is the tropical rainforest. Now, the tropical rainforest, just because even though it doesn't cover that much of the planet's surface, trees are very good at doing photosynthesis, and they do a lot of primary productivity. All right, so the big idea behind these or the matter cycles and the energy cycles. Energy doesn't recycle. It's transformed into, so energy doesn't recycle. It's transformed into an unusable form as latent heat, never to be recaptured. Matter is recycled and converted to different forms by natural processes. We've got about 5 to 10 billion years worth of energy left in the sun. We'll have to figure out something to do after that. Sun burns out. Water cycle, the only thing that you really have to know about this is transpiration, is evaporation of water from plants. And as we've learned about with the water unit in Chapter 3, that's a combination of evaporation, adhesion, and cohesion in the tubes of the plants. The carbon cycle, two major processes here. Carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis, taken into plants during primary productivity, photosynthesis. And then plants, animals, and decomposers return carbon back to the atmosphere during cellular respiration. Also, burning of fossil fuels and woods increases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is not usable by plants, unlike carbon dioxide, and must be turned into the form of nitrates before it can be taken up by the roots of plants. The first step to making nitrogen usable by organisms is to fix it as a compound by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They are found in the soil naturally, as well as found on the roots of things like peanuts and soybeans, which are a type of plant called legumes. Legumes have extra nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Occasionally, farmers plant extra legumes in order to return nitrogen to the soil. Then we have nitrifying bacteria. Nitrifying bacteria converts the ammonia made by the nitrogen-fixing bacteria to a more usable form for the plants called nitrates. Nitrates, NO3, are taken up through the roots by root uptake in a process called assimilation and taken into the plant. Plants use nitrogen for proteins and DNA mainly. Animals get their carbon and nitrogen from their foods that they eat. Denitrifying bacteria returns nitrogen gas back to the atmosphere. The reason why nitrogen is not available to the plants is because nitrogen in the atmosphere is held together by a triple covalent bond, too tough for plants to break, but not too tough for archaebacteria in the soil to break. The phosphorus cycle has a fairly simple cycle for the organic part, the living part. The plants take it up through the roots, through the soil, in the form of phosphate. Animals get their phosphorus from the plants they eat. Decomposition returns phosphorus back to the soil to be reused by plants. The only other thing you need to know about the phosphorus cycle is there is some geologic cycling of phosphorus. And here we have uplift, basically tectonic plates and things like batholiths underground pushing up on rock. There's phosphates in rocks. The weathering of rocks caused by erosion and basically water dissolving the rocks, as water is the universal solvent, allowing it to run off into streams, and then in lakes the phosphorus can build up. Things like algae make use of the phosphorus and nitrogen to create more members of their species, and that can create an algae bloom. Heterotrophs, remember, are other feeders. They get their energy from eating others, and they consume the organic molecules. These are the consumers. Things like fungi and animals are heterotrophs. Autotrophs, self-feeders, get their energy from their self. They actually get it from inorganic carbon dioxide and other sources, and then they turn those molecules into organic molecules, mainly sugar. The autotrophs give their energy to the heterotrophs. There's the energy cycle. Photosynthesis takes up carbon dioxide, water, and light, produces sugar, glucose, and oxygen. Those are used during cell respiration to make ATP energy. Cell respiration produces carbon dioxide and water, which could be then in turn used by photosynthesis. All right, primary productivity. Basically, photosynthesis makes food in the form of organic molecules like sugar. More photosynthesis, more food energy usable in the ecosystem. That's why the tropical rainforest has a lot more energy and a lot more animals than a desert. The two places on the planet that do the most photosynthesis are the oceans, just because there's so much ocean, and the tropical rainforest. Oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. Fish and other animals do better in water with lots of oxygen for cell respiration. Now, it's not the oxygen that primary productivity is all about. It's mainly the amount of organic material or sugars being made by the plants that we're referring to. So, gross primary productivity is the total amount of organic compounds being made by the producers. After you subtract out the respiration done by those autotrophs, done by the plants, after they've met their needs for survival, whatever's left over as far as organic molecules available to consumers is called net primary productivity. More net primary productivity, more animals that can be supported in an ecosystem. Terrestrial biomes on the equator, the two major biomes are the tropical rainforest and savanna. 30 degrees north and south, we find the world's deserts as a result of the rain dropping on the tropical rainforest on the equator, cycling in a kind of a circular weather pattern, and drier descending on the 30 degrees north and south latitude. Then as we get a little bit further up and lower down in latitude, we get into the areas that have things like deciduous forest. Deciduous forest is found on the eastern part of the United States. Think like Bambi or Robin Hood forest. They have the big leafy trees, but there is a cold season in deciduous forest, unlike the tropical rainforest. Deciduous forest also is mainly Europe. Here we have chaparral. Chaparral is kind of like savanna, kind of grasslands, but with a cold season. Here we have the grasslands in the middle of continents that tend to have less water, and grass does better than trees or shrubs in the middle of continents typically. The grasslands have the best growing crop soil in the world, so that's why we tend to see all our farms in the grasslands east of Aurora. Then over here we have the taiga, also called coniferous forest, basically needle tree plants. The smaller needles have less surface area for losing water, and they tend to do better in drier and colder climates. There is some taiga in the wetter climates of Washington. Up here in Russia, you see a lot of taiga also. Then we get to the place where it's too cold for even trees to grow, and that's tundra. And tundra has a permanently frozen layer of ground called permafrost. Here we have a graph of the two abiotic factors that define biomes: temperature and rainfall, precipitation. Of course, tropical rainforest, always hot, lots of water. Temperate deciduous forest, Bambi forest, tends to be a little bit more warm than coniferous forest and a little wetter. Grasslands tend to be drier than the forest areas, and they have more temperature extremes, mainly due to the lack of water. Deserts can get really cold at night, again due to the lack of water absorbing heat energy, and they get really hot during the day. The two driest biomes are tundra, which is cold all the time and dry, and deserts, which are hot and dry but cold sometimes. Adaptations of plants and animals to abiotic factors, living things have to respond to the non-living environment. Scrawny animals with big ears and large surface areas tend to do better in drier and hotter climates because they can dissipate heat better, whereas thicker animals tend to survive better in warmer or colder climates because they can conserve their body heat better. Behaviors also can be selected for by nature too. In desert areas, animals tend to have behaviors to come out at night, nocturnal behaviors, and that allows them to survive in the desert because they're not out during the daytime. All right, then we get into chapter 55 stuff, acid rain pollutants. There's two sources, or two compounds that cause it, nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide. I think of it as not sunny, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and these will cause acid rain, things like sulfuric acid when it mixes with water. Power plants, industry, and transportation, like burning fossil fuels in cars, tends to produce these compounds that cause acid rain. Biomagnification, and also remember that fish and trees, plants, are the most affected by acid rain. Biomagnification, we have a magnifying of pollutants or toxins as it moves up the trophic levels in a food chain. So here we have an example of DDT. There was also PCBs that affect the herrings, another type of bird. Basically, we have, like, let's say 1 dose in the water getting the zooplankton. Ignore the numbers for now, we're just kind of trying to understand the concept here. If each one of these zooplankton have 1 dose and the small fish eat 10 zooplankton, now the small fish have 10 doses. Because DDT is persistent and doesn't degrade right away, it stays in an ecosystem for a long time. Nowadays we use pesticides that break down fairly quickly, so we don't have as much problem with biomagnification. If the small fish get 10 doses in them, and a bigger fish eats 10 small fish, 10 times 10 is 100 doses stored in the tissues of the large fish. And then if you have an eagle eating 10 fish, that each have 100 doses in them. Now we have 1,000 doses in the top predators. It's the top predators that are the most affected by biomagnification. In the case of eagles, their eggs become brittle and they break when they try to hatch them. The greenhouse effect, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and methane are all the greenhouse gases that trap heat energy better than other gases. The sunlight hits the planet's surface, heats up gases, and creates kind of like a warm security blanket of gas around this planet. However, too much carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and methane trap too much heat, creating a warming effect on the planet called global warming. So the greenhouse effect comes first, caused by greenhouse gases produced by various processes, some natural, some man-made. For example, carbon dioxide is produced from not only cell respiration and volcanic activity, but also from power plants, burning fossil fuels, and burning down forests. Methane is produced by basically cow farts or gases produced by animals. And we have a lot of cows because we like our meat. Then we have another man's effect on the environment. CFCs destroy the ozone layer that protects us from UV light that can cause skin cancer. So when CFCs destroyed the ozone layer in Antarctica, that caused a real problem for anyone visiting Antarctica, and you can get a sunburn very quickly if you travel down south. The chlorine from CFCs binds with O3, which is ozone, breaks it apart into O2, which does not block UV light. Now we have chlorine oxides that combine together, sunlight rips it apart, and then oxygen is released, and then chlorine atoms are released. Now the big issue that you have to see here is that the chlorine atoms are used over and over again. So the chlorine used over and over and over, breaking down more and more ozone. Now as it turns out, even though we do have CFCs in Antarctica still, the chlorine is being taken out of the atmosphere by natural processes, so the ozone hole is closing. Remember that it's the good ozone that we're talking about that's being destroyed by CFCs high up in the atmosphere, in the stratosphere, not the smog created by pollution from cars mainly and burning fossil fuels that we associate with bad ozone and asthma in cities. Deforestation is the #1 reason animals are going extinct on this planet, mainly because we need more space for farms and land, and as a result they lose their homes and they go bye-bye. Loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity caused by exponential growth. Exponential growth of humans is the root cause of many of these problems, and especially of deforestation. Fragmented habitat, animals that are trapped in these little fragmented areas sometimes don't move across these clear-cut areas and get trapped here. If they get trapped there, they end up going through an extinction vortex, where a small population interbreeds. They have a lot more mutations and problems in the children, which means loss of population. Lower population, more inbreeding, more death, and eventually you go extinct. This is called an extinction vortex. It's estimated you need a couple hundred individuals to kind of keep the genetics of a population fresh and prevent the inbreeding problems and genetic drift from causing issues with the population. All right, this ends the content for ecology, and use your Barron Study Guide as well to review the important things that we covered in class.